everyone try and share screen as quickly as possible. There we go. So this is going to be perhaps a little bit different to what you're used to from trauma care. So I'm talking about the realistic challenges of military trauma simulation. This is very much an education themed webinar rather than a clinically themed webinar. Who am I? My name is Dr. Cara Swain. I hold the rank of Surgeon Lieutenant Commander in the Royal Navy. I'm a General Surgical Registrar working for the Defence Medical Services, and you may have seen me around the Southwest. I've worked in Bristol and Plymouth and a few other areas. But currently, I'm actually a PhD student at the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, doing a medical education-based PhD. And that is because my interest is in simulation. And I've got a real interest in sort of how we can make things more realistic. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the dreaded word fidelity that some of you may have come across when you talk about simulation. So I am affiliated to everyone you see on the screen, apart from trauma care. That's just here because I thought it was nice to add. But it goes without saying that anything I say tonight is based on my opinion and is not representative of any of the organisations that I happen to work with. So I'm sure you all know this, and I've put the surgery in brackets because I started talking from a trauma surgery point of view and I realised, hold on, this isn't about trauma surgery. Trauma requires a team of different healthcare professionals to manage complex injury patterns under critical time pressure. That is how I lead whenever I introduce trauma simulation, because I think it's one of the most important elements to remember. The real challenge that I see in practice of managing traumatic injuries is that there's no set pattern. The decision-making processes and the life-saving actions are determined based on the particular patient that we have in front of us, the mechanisms of injury, and any resources they've got available. And in this country, at least, the management of trauma is a relatively rare event, but medical professionals have to be prepared to save those, to use those skills in order to save life. And simulation is one technique they can rehearse to do so. So what is simulation? Well, it's a practical learning technique that replaces our real experiences with guided ones. It is used in many fields, and the most common one that people talk to me about when they say, oh, you're into simulation, is people talk to me about flying. Now, during both medical and aviation simulation, trainees will spend time learning valuable lessons in a safe environment, which allows them to make and learn from their mistakes without perhaps crashing an expensive piece of equipment or risking their or other lives. But I'm telling you, there are problems with aligning simulation in aviation and medicine. Aeroplanes and the associated physics are fixed and therefore predictable. The mathematical models that are used to design aviation simulations are really accurate. Flying a plane is a really controlled procedure. I'm sure we can all agree that medicine, especially in the context of trauma, is less controlled. In a flight simulator and in real air flight, a pilot obtains information from visual cues outside the aircraft. But in poor visibility, they use a really small array of instruments on their dashboard to dictate their decision-making. Humans, though, aren't machines, and a human responses to a variety of stimuli will vary significantly. Medical professionals will use a really subtle, wide array of cues to make judgments. These are things like patients' facial expression, their skin colour, muscle tone, the smell, perhaps. And these are really difficult to replicate effectively in simulation. Now, I'm afraid no webinar is about this is any good without any talk of simulation theory. So I'm going to talk to you about the three domains of simulation, which is the scope, the modality, and the environment. And these domains were described in a paper by Choi et al. In 2017, and the reference is at the top if you're interested. I've actually stolen a really nice, creatively borrowed, a diagram from a paper by Aurora et al., which talks about the scope of simulation. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have taken part in simulation before. It can really be focused on three different levels. At the very simple level, you've got micro simulation. This is skills training. This is learning to take blood from an arm. So it's really just focusing on the basic motor and cognitive skills, and is done with relatively simplistic models with an individual healthcare provider. You then go up a level, think about meso simulation, and the focus there is on clinical teams. It might just be a team of the same professionals, but it can also be a team of different interacting healthcare professionals. And when you get to meso simulation, you're starting not just to look at motor and cognitive skills, but also that higher cognitive, behavioral, non-technical skills. And the format of those simulations is often becoming a bit more broad. And then finally, you've got macro simulation, and that is an organizational level institution. So that will be the whole hospital. This is things like a mass casualty exercise where you've got pre-hospital and hospital working together. And the skills there are really trying to check that the organization is fit for purpose. My favorite thing is to talk about modalities, because when anyone talks about simulation, what they're actually talking about generally is the simulator. And in trauma simulation, you've got a huge array of modalities that you can use. And I've put some of the most common ones on the screen at the moment. If you're a surgeon, you might tell me that the gold standard modality for trauma training or surgical training is cadavers. A lot of times people use standardized patients, but obviously the problem with using a standardized patient or an actor is that when it comes to actually operating on them, they don't like that very much, and ethically that's not really required. Mannequins, there are a huge array of mannequins out there. You've got ones that, Resusciani is the most common one, but you've got ones that have all the bells and whistles. So the Laerdal SimMan 3G that has pulses, it can blink, it can talk, can do all sorts of things. I've got up in the top corner, we've got task trainers. So those are usually models that have a part of a body where you can simulate a specific task. And then certainly now we're becoming more FA with computer-based models. And I see those a lot in surgical practice. Some of the laparoscopic and robotic simulators are absolutely amazing. Less computer-based simulation available for trauma training, however, and I'll get into that. And the one that I've left out is live animals, which is right in the middle. Some of you may never have heard the fact that live animals are used in simulation, mainly because it is not done in the UK, but it's certainly done around the world. Oh, excuse me. Finally, we've got our simulated environment. So where does your simulation happen? It can happen in a classroom. It can be a mock-up environment. So someone might recreate a theatre. In the military simulation, we recreate a tent and create a casualty clearing station. You might do your simulation in situ. You might run a simulation in the back of your ambulance, or you might actually do your simulation in a virtual or augmented world. And then you have to think of the environment as whether it is fixed or whether it is movable. Here's an example of a macro simulation. So this was the Aurora et al. Paper, and I've picked papers that are actually military simulation papers. What Aurora et al. Did was they wrote about a full hospital simulation across an entire patient pathway. This was published in 2014, but was actually, I think, conducted in 2010. And the simulation was a recreated HOSPEX, a hospital exercise. They built an exact replica, or a very, very similar replica of Camp Bastion Hospital in Afghanistan, and they built it inside a warehouse. And then they put participants, lived in that simulation for 3 days as part of their pre-deployment training. And then they introduced them to patients that they would expect to see when they were in Afghanistan. They use standardized patients. They also use some kind of task trainers. And this was really impressive level of simulation, something that the military did specifically to prepare for going out to Afghanistan. But there is one problem with it, in that it is not especially practical. It was really, really good for recreating and preparing the people to go for that specific environment. But as we all know, in trauma, and particularly in the current world with war fighting, we don't actually know where we're going to go and where we're going to be working. So it's very difficult to recreate your environment. I've got another example here, and this one's more recent. This is by Bevan et al. And was published in 2021. This was what was called an ultra high fidelity military cadaveric surgical simulation. And the purpose of their simulation was to replicate, they said, in intricate detail, receiving casualties, resuscitating them, performing damage control surgery, and then transferring them on to critical care recovery. This wasn't a live-in simulation. It was done over 2 days, but it was done at, trying to remember this accurately. I think it was done for 8 to 9 hours of simulation at a time over 2 different days, but again, conducted with military personnel in preparation for a specific deployment. Now, you cannot talk about simulation without talking about fidelity. And if any of you have heard me speak before, you will have probably heard me talking about it. It is really important. Magagi et al., Magagi's a relatively famous medical educationalist, said that fidelity is one of the 12 features and best practice in using medical simulation technology to maximum educational benefit. And if anyone talks about simulation, they'll mention it. What is it? It's actually from the Latin, meaning fides, which means faithful. And it's really used as a synonym for accuracy, precision, or exactness. And when I started thinking about fidelity, I actually asked out on Twitter, what do people think? And these were some of the responses I got from medical professionals. So generally, people understand what fidelity means. When you look in the literature, so this was a search I did in Google Scholar, you would, in 2022, September, you would be forgiven for thinking that fidelity is actually a binary concept, that it is high or low, because that is what comes out in the literature. And some of these studies that I've highlighted here, so the NIM-BULCA study, randomized controlled trial of high fidelity versus low fidelity simulation in neonatal resuscitation, they used one particular type of simulator and then a different type of simulator that didn't have as many bells and whistles. Another study at the bottom, the Mammoth study, again, used the simulator SimMan 3G, which has spontaneous breathing and measurable blood pressure. And then the low fidelity group used a Resusciani simulator. And then they did it in a hospital ward, as opposed to in an intensive care room. So I extrapolated, and we'll give you an example now of some high or low surgical simulators. So during the early part of the COVID pandemic, surgical trainees started to panic that we weren't getting enough training, and a load of us went away and created our own laparoscopic training boxes. And here's an example using an iPad, cardboard box, and some laparoscopic instruments. Low fidelity simulator. High fidelity simulator, you can see here as an example produced by surgical theatre in a simulated operating room with all of the correct kit and equipment. Everything looks very accurate. But despite what the literature might make you believe, fidelity is not just related to the level of technical sophistication or is an attribute just of your patient model. Two of the respondents to me, when I asked about what fidelity means to them, talked about anything which enables the learner to suspend disbelief and approximate the real world situation. For them, they said it had to feel real, from the timing, monitoring, the feel of the tissue, the level of stress, minimizing faculty verbal input. So not only does it need to feel real, but it has to involve a multidisciplinary team approach. So for me, there are actually 3 different but overlapping domains which you have to consider when you think about simulation and fidelity. And that is your patient model, your environment, and your scenario. Now, again, if you look in the literature about fidelity and simulation, there are lots of different types or categories. The terms are numerous, they're interchangeable. So this is my interpretation of the fidelity terminology, and I think it roughly maps to these domains. So the key aspects that you need to think about, something called physical fidelity. That's whether something looks real, which relates to both the model and to the environment. And then you've got functional fidelity. So whether it behaves like it's real, which relates to the model and the scenario that's being played out. And it's where these domains and types of fidelity come together that you achieve psychological fidelity, where learners begin to believe that it's real. Now, I can't see any of you, and if you're sitting here going, what on earth is this woman talking about? It might get a little bit vague, but I will loop this back to something sensible at the end, I promise. So talking about simulation that feels real, why are these sci-fi concepts so effective? Well, the fact is that the appearance and behavior of the simulation was so close to real life. Now, admittedly, in The Matrix or The Truman Show, if you've ever seen those films, the people inside the simulation were being deceived. They didn't know that they were involved in a simulation. And clearly that's not ethical. We can't do that to people when we're training them. But in the holodeck of the Starship Enterprise, users could go there and very much suspend their disbelief and live within that world. So when you conduct simulation, either as a learner or as an educator, it requires a fiction contract. There's a requirement to accept that certain limitations are there, and a requirement that they are willingly fooled and accept that those limitations just can't be bypassed. So fidelity is a flawed concept and a moving target. Weird things to say, I know. In a 2014 article that was written by a guy called Hamstra, he stated that fidelity is flawed. It's often considered as an overall descriptor and not as a function of its various different attributes. And he actually went as far as to say that we should abandon the term fidelity entirely. He described it as a moving target. And that's true because different people will view a simulator as high or low fidelity, depending on the features being used for a given task. So we've all probably heard the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, a judgment on fidelity relates to the type of learner and their experience. So, for example, if I took part in a simulation where I was arrested and taken to prison, it might look and feel very realistic to me because I've got no experience of being arrested and I don't work within law enforcement and I don't know anything about that. But I can very easily highlight the flaws in a medical simulation, especially a surgical simulation, because of my experience. So in order for me to buy in or suspend my disbelief, the level of fidelity across various different domains has to be higher now. So what I'm saying is that for learners of perhaps lesser experience, they can benefit from lower fidelity simulation because it has less of a cognitive overload. It's important that you pre-brief your people and orientate them to the limits of the simulation and to the context. And this can really help to alter the learner's perception. And then they can almost project fidelity onto the event. So, as I said, fidelity is a moving target. This is an example of my own work and or work that I've done with some colleagues within the military. We started creating a surgical anatomy model. So common problem within military medicine is that of junctional hemorrhage. We've got very good at controlling hemorrhage from limbs, but still controlling junctional hemorrhage is very difficult. And there was a desire for a surgical anatomy model, a simulator that you could operate on to actually stop the bleeding. And over several iterations of a military course called the MOST course, the Military Operational Specialist Team Training course, we, myself and Professor Pallister, who actually designed this model, it got iterative feedback from users. So we started off with actually just a groin model that had a gunshot wound in it, moved to a shoulder model, and eventually created a mannequin that you can see here that had a working circulation that could be operated on. And the surgeons really felt like it was a useful model for them to work on. It was very interesting to watch them start to cut down, recognize all the anatomy, and they were really absorbed in the task. As we developed with the study, we put the model inside a multidisciplinary team setting. And what we found was that our anesthetic and emergency medicine colleagues didn't report it as being high fidelity because he didn't intubate that as well. And his chest didn't ventilate quite as well. And there were other aspects that they considered important that the surgeons considered less so. So it really highlighted to me the importance of thinking about not only what model you're using, but also how you're using it and what the learning objectives are. I'm just checking a couple of the questions. I've got a great one here. Do you think the terms high fidelity and high reality are more useful? That's a really good question. I think that referring to fidelity as high or low is wrong if you don't quantify the aspects that you're considering as high or low fidelity. And I think now knowing or recognizing that different learners will see something as high or low fidelity depending on what they're doing means that those terms aren't very useful. Talking about reality, potentially that is more useful. I've started to change my language to say more higher or lower fidelity and then to quantify why I would say so, but I certainly don't describe models as high or low fidelity anymore. So I hope that answers that. I said again, fidelity is a moving target. And again, so my PhD is looking at the use of live animal models. And I've recently had a systematic review accepted on this, looking at live animal use in the emergency management of trauma. And I didn't just focus on surgical trauma. I actually looked at trauma from point of wounding care, so including the pre-hospital environment, right the way through to damage control surgery. And we did a thematic analysis of all the included articles, and there were 4 interconnecting themes in relation to live animal models in trauma. But I think some of this actually overlaps with what people want from trauma simulation in general. So the first theme was that of recreating the experience. It wasn't just about the model itself. They wanted to feel everything within the environment felt like it was a real experience for them. They wanted as close to a real clinical experience as they could achieve. Something about trauma that is different to a lot of other simulation is what I termed a theme of TikTok dynamics of hemorrhage. Hemorrhage in trauma dictates your decision making. And I called it TikTok because nothing to do with social media, obviously, but because time matters. If you don't manage that hemorrhage at the appropriate time, and it is dynamic and it can change with the situation, then your patient isn't going to do as well. And that is something that with trauma simulation is really difficult to manage. And a lot of modalities on the market, so a lot of human patient simulators, don't bleed. And that is why people still think that a live animal model is still so effective. There is an emotional impact component to trauma simulation. People want to feel engaged. They want to feel something in relation to that simulation. And I'll go on to another study that I've done and why that is important. But the most important theme of what people wanted from surgical trauma simulation was this idea of self-efficacy. At the end of the simulation, they want to really believe that they can do something. And it's not usually just a specific skill. It is performing that skill, making the right clinical decisions in a wider environment. I did my second study, which is yet unpublished, was a focus group study of military medical personnel, asking specifically about their use of live animal models. And these were some of the themes that came up, and I've highlighted here fidelity, and this is why I talk about it so often, because it comes up so much in my work. What I found, and I'm going to pause because I've forgotten what my next slide is. There we go. What I found particularly interesting is that in this particular group, qualified physicians, and the physicians were surgeons, anaesthetists, and emergency physicians and GPs, and then military medics, think about their trauma simulation in different ways, and they think about the emotions attached to it in different ways. And I think this will translate to some of you who are observing this webinar tonight. The qualified physicians wanted to be engaged with the simulation. They wanted to feel the emotions. They particularly wanted to feel stressed. They wanted to know that they could manage their stress in difficult situations and perform in front of their colleagues and for themselves. In contrast, the military medics wanted to feel, they used the word desensitized. They wanted to have these feelings. They wanted to experience something when they were involved in the trauma simulation, and they wanted to know what that feeling was so that they didn't have to deal with it again in the future. And I thought that was a really interesting finding. For qualified physicians and those of us in the medical profession that have an awful lot of experience with patients, it's difficult to experience a simulation that is close to a real clinical experience. But for the military medics, it might be their first experience of managing death or coping with the feeling of loss or grief. These are people that haven't had a lot of skin-to-skin contact. They haven't perhaps seen someone bleeding heavily in front of them before, but they are people who are fighting on the front line in war zones. They are using simulation to become psychologically resilient to what they are seeing and doing. So I found that these groups are really at odds with each other in this aspect, with one wanting to be emotionally invested and the other wished to be emotionally void. Both of them yet wanting to feel more confident, but linking back to this idea of self-efficacy and believing they can do it. So I said at the start that dealing with trauma involves managing complex injury patterns under some real critical time pressure. So why is trauma simulation so challenging? And I've deliberately left out military trauma simulation here because when I was thinking about this presentation, the military has some unique facets, but actually trauma simulation is really challenging. So scope, let's start with linking back to that. We're not dealing in trauma simulation generally with micro simulation, because by the time you get to manage trauma, you know the tasks that you need to do. You know you're going to be putting in an IV cannula, getting perhaps IO access. You might have learned the skill of putting in a surgical airway. What you're doing in your scope of surgical trauma simulation, or should I say trauma simulation in general, is working in the team-based structure. So it's paramedics working with doctors, it's then handing over to a hospital team, and then also working at the macro simulation level. You might be working in a austere environment, transferring your patient by road or by air to a casualty reception centre, and then moving them back to definitive care. That's not something that is done in a lot of other simulations. So trauma simulation is challenging just from the sheer size of the scope. It's also, as I said, multidisciplinary. Yes, a lot of simulations are multidisciplinary, but trauma is always a multidisciplinary sport. Modality, which is best? We can talk about this all night, and I'm more than happy to take lots and lots of questions on this. The jury's out, I have to say. There are benefits of all of these different types of modalities in trauma simulation. There are some fantastic standardized patients out there. In military trauma sim, we used a company called Amputees in Actions for a long time, a group of people who came and did their own makeup and really performed to a terrifying level, actually, what it's like to have to lose a limb to an IED. Just phenomenal, and allowed us to do an awful amount with them. Some of the mannequins are excellent, depending on what you want to do. Cadaveric training is always going to be a mainstay of trauma sim, providing you have access to the cadavers, providing you have access to an area where you can use them. Task trainers and computer-based models also equally good. But actually, probably for trauma sim at the moment, there is no one particular model that will do everything, and you are always going to have to swap and change between models to achieve your learning objectives. And then finally, your environment. Trauma can happen anywhere. So where do you place your simulation? Do you place it in the pre-hospital environment? It might have to move around. Is it worth doing it in an emergency department? There is no fixed place for trauma sim. Whereas if you're doing surgical simulation, generally, you're going to be in an operating theatre. Most operating theatres in the UK, although not exactly the same, are pretty easily reproducible, which is why laparoscopic simulators have had are so easily developed. That's wrong, I shouldn't say they're so easily developed, but they've been so easily implemented, because recreating a laparoscopic stack and then replacing what someone can see and then putting the instruments into an object to perform the surgery is relatively easy to replace. But in trauma sim, where do you do that? Why do you do that? Where's the best environment to do it? So key challenges, I think, actually are military and civilian. The key for me is designing a simulation with learning outcomes for various disciplines and professions. That is a hugely difficult challenge, and it is impossible to please everyone all the time. As someone who's been involved with simulation for quite some time, if you direct a simulation to suit your surgeons, then other professions will, I was about to say not be happy, but potentially might lose out. So it is very difficult to make sure that everyone is achieving what they need in a multidisciplinary simulation. I've explained to you, or tried to explain to you, that the fidelity requirements are different across different domains. It might be important, it might be really important that you have a model that people can operate on. It might be really important that you have a model that bleeds. It might be incredibly important that you have a model that is anatomically accurate. Fine, but then it might be really important that you have someone that you can interact with, that you can practice those communication skills with. It becomes particularly difficult. Your scenarios have to be written in such a way that they are accurate so that people can't pick holes in them. And trauma, as I said, because of the nature of trauma patients and the fact that they react so differently, it's very difficult to write those simulations. You could have the same patient or a similar patient in the same accident and they'll have a different pattern of injury. They'll have different responses. So getting the scenario right is particularly difficult. And then finally, and this might be more related to military, but also, you know, civilian, depending on the where you're working and what has happened. Medical management is often in trauma part of strategic operations. We don't just do medicine in isolation. in the military, it actually depends on what is going on around us. How safe is it? Are we in a permissive environment? Are we being shot at? Do we need to move our hospital? Do we need to protect? Do we need to prepare to receive more casualties? And again, in the civilian setting, medical management comes in as part of, well, is this a one-off incident? Is this going to be part of several more incidents that come in? Is this one casualty? Is this several casualties? Do we have enough resources to cope with this? And particularly in the current climate with the NHS, that's something that needs to be thought about. How much space do we have in resus? Do we need to get these paramedics out the door again to go back to the incident? So when I say about realistic challenges of trauma simulation, it is particularly difficult, and I would love to hear from people how we can do it better, and it's something that I probably will spend the rest of my career working on. I have rattled through incredibly quickly, much quicker than I was expecting to. Thank you very much for listening. I hope some of that has been useful. It's been a slightly different flavour of webinar than I know Trauma Care normally deliver. I am more than happy to take any questions. So Anna, if you're there, fire away.
Brilliant. I mean, you might have fired through it, but it was full of content and a lot to think about as well, in terms of, and as well, sort of being open for discussion. So I don't know if people want to jump on that, as well as asking questions of what can be done different, or how do you guys do it as well. But now is the chance, my friend, to ask any questions that you may have. We do have plenty of time left as well, so don't feel shy about asking questions. No question is a stupid question. It's always great to get them come in. However, first off, I just want to press escape, because I've done that thing again where I lose my mouse when I go full screen for some reason. Stop share. I love it when it does that. That's the joys of having one screen for you rather than my usual dual screen. Where is it? There we are. We'll keep it like this for now. You can all see it that way anyway. So just to bring to your attention our next webinar, which will be taking place next Friday, I believe, if my calculations are correct, or the Friday after if my calculations are wrong. However, if you scan the QR code that's on your screen now, the next webinar will be a rebroadcast, what we call our Trauma Care Classic webinars. We will be reshowing, yes, the external hemorrhage control, presented originally by Colonel Paul Parker. If any of you have been to a trauma care webinar before with Paul Parker, you will know he is a very charismatic man, and we absolutely love having him on our screens, and we're very excited that he is joining us for this webinar. So he's going to be back to give an update, answer any questions that may have come along since, and if you're watching it for the first time, any questions you may have for the first time. So that being said, now is your chance to purchase your CPD certificates if you are not a member of Trauma Care. If you are a member of Trauma Care, do not worry, you don't have to scan this QR code. Your certificate will be sent to you. However, if you are not a member, do scan the QR code that's on your screen now. It'll take you to a type form, fill in the reflective form, and we will send your certificate to you in due course. Now, luckily, we have had some questions come through. I'm not wearing my glasses today, so if I come up really, really close to the screen, that's why, everybody. I'm sorry, I'm not being weird. So, Evangelos has asked, hello, how reproducible is a military environment? It is quite different to Afghanistan and deploy in Ukraine. So basically, how can you recreate a military environment in simulation terms?
Yeah, really great question. I feel like this is going to be answered a lot of this. It's incredibly difficult. So you have to think about what environment you're trying to recreate. So Afghanistan had two environments that you need to think about. So we had Camp Bastion, which was a hospital complex, which was, I wouldn't say easy to recreate, but it was at least a fixed environment, and people coming back to the UK could say, no, it's like this, and we have this here, this is the way we move. And it meant that people, as in the Aurora study, could go to a complete replica of what Camp Bastion was, and when they went out there could go, this feels very familiar. But there was also the secondary environment, which was what people were experiencing on the ground. So you had a very hot, very dry, very arid environment, which was more difficult to reproduce, but people did start to do it. So recently I was over in America, in the United, I always get this wrong, USIS, the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, there we go, and they created, they call it the WAVE, it's the Wide Area Virtual Environment. So it is a room where they've got screens all around, and they could project what felt like to me like I was in a video game, and they projected what looked like a scene in Baghdad, and you could have people popping up out of buildings and shooting at you. They then had sandbags on the floor, and they recreated what we would call a sanger, and then had personnel in there. And what they then did was then they recreated an environment where you could have helicopter evacuation. So you would move to the other end of their environment, get inside a mock helicopter, and then the screens around you would demonstrate as if you were lifting off, and the platform would shake. And absolutely phenomenal. And I was speaking to them about how easy it would be to recreate new environments, how long it would take to recreate an environment. They are saying at the moment that, with the right information, they can create something within a couple of months. The question was in relation to Ukraine. So Ukraine is, from my understanding, is more urban. It's more urban warfare. There are a lot more risks of falling buildings. Recreating that is very difficult because it's so dangerous. So they're extracting people from piles of rocks, piles of rubble, and recreating that safely in a simulation is very, very difficult. So you have that aspect of recreating sim, and Anna, if I'm going on too long, just nod at me. But then you also have to think about injuries you're recreating. So Afghanistan injuries were IEDs. We got very good at noticing injury patterns, people standing on IEDs and getting blast injuries. So we knew what to expect. The Ukrainian injuries are different. They're injuries that we've not really seen for quite some time, and they're not things that we've been practicing. So when I've been working in Sweden, we've been dealing with trying to simulate hemorrhage injuries that are shrapnel based, but with lots of, so usually on the torso or on the thorax, and sometimes on the limbs. But they're wide areas with lots of shear, with lots of different bleeding points, with embedded metals. They're not wounds that we've been used to be dealing with. So trying to work out how we can simulate those injuries and how to manage those is difficult. So the question originally was, I said, how reproducible is the military environment? Potentially, yes, it's reproducible, but there are lots of different aspects that you need to think about. Is it quite different in Afghanistan to Ukraine? Yes, they're completely different wars, and they're completely different locations to fight in, different weapons, different injury patterns, and it's requiring a different way to think about our casualties, especially when you think about in Afghanistan, the casualty evacuation was a very slick, very quick process by the end. Ukraine is less so, and so we're not just talking about Ukraine, but casualty evacuation in places like Syria as well, where your evacuation lines are being targeted. The Ukrainians are extracting casualties and having to fight alongside, and that's a really difficult thing to simulate safely.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. It's how to do it safely and realistically all at the same time. I mean, one of our brilliant academic partners is actually the University of Sunderland, and they've got a similar room at their campus that you were just describing, which I had the pleasure of seeing. But we went 2 weeks before Christmas holidays, so our room was a house fire that was going on, with Santa Claus had dropped dead in the middle of the room, which is easier for paramedic students. But yeah, I can see how that would work. And Abby has put in the chat, so I'm going to quote this one. Thank you for your talk. It was very enlightening. I was wondering if there has been any recent innovations in simulation or up and coming ones specific to the military. So like you were saying, the platform, or if there are any others as well. It's something that they could talk about in their interview. So I'm assuming they've got something coming up.
Yeah, Abby, absolutely. So most of the innovations at the moment are relating to hemorrhage control models. So the actual modality. So everyone wants to know how they can have a model that bleeds. That is a real big issue with trauma sim, and that is why I'm doing a PhD looking at live animal models, because we want to know if we should be doing it, and if we should, how. So that is one version of it. So you have the up and coming innovations. There are now perfused cadaver models that have been used in the UK. So they are used in the States. They are fresh they're not fresh frozen cadavers, but they are very fresh cadavers that have a perfusion circulation put through them. They are very effective. They look very realistic, but they are incredibly expensive. And obviously you need to be in a situation where you can actually procure cadavers and consent people in advance that that's what you're going to do with them. There are plenty of silicon and other type models that are coming on the market, which are having a circulation put through them for bleeding purposes and management of bleeding. But the other innovation is very much in the I suppose tech space. So virtual reality is getting a real is really having its day at the moment. And that's not just creating virtual environments for us to work in. Because the advantage, of course, with the wide area virtual environments that we're dealing with is that you could have Ukraine projected one day, and then with relatively simplistic, just changing what you have on the ground in front of you, you could then be in a forest in Norway and project something completely different and run a very different style of simulation in the same room. The other thing that I would say particularly pertinent for trauma is the concept of virtual patients. So there are now there's gamification that is coming. So it will be like doing your, instead of going to ATLS and doing your moulage and standing there and going through, you will do it on a computer where you will have a virtual patient and you will have your avatar, healthcare professional, and you will make your decisions. And I have a couple of colleagues at the Karolinska Institute who are working on those. Those are big innovations. And I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we will see a lot more virtual work coming into a lot of the simulation courses that are available.
Yeah, and one of our sponsors as well, Icarus, they do something very similar. They do VR headsets, trauma simulation training. So they literally, everyone stood in an empty warehouse just wearing VR headsets, and they've got courses coming up on that. Actually, I think the next one's in October potentially, and that's very similar. It's just VR headset, the gloves on as well, and you're working on virtual patients that way or in trauma simulation settings. So it's very cool, the future of simulation and training as well. Lovely Ian has asked, what about the cost? Do actors such as the amputees, I could actually answer this one. Do actors such as the amputees cost more or less than expensive Gucci mannequins? Also, has the benefit of clinicians playing casualty being measured as a learning experience, i.e. knowing what it feels like to be a patient? So shoe on the other foot kind of thing. On the actors one, I can tell you actors, depends who it is. It depends on the actor, it depends on their equity, it depends. I'm an ex-actor, so this is why I know all of this, but it depends if they're an agent, freelance, their equity, who the company themselves is. The base rate that you play that you pay an actor to play a live simulation completely depends on the actor themselves and the company that's hiring them. So sometimes it will be really expensive if you're looking at an ATAC course that do it over the weekend where you're asking someone to be a train crash victim. You could be asking an actor could be asking you, and I would have asked for about £1,000 for that weekend. But then you might get some actors who are starting up that will only ask for £250 or £50, and then it's all sorts of different factors go into the cost of the actors in these things, really. And us as a charity, if we ever got actors, we'd sort of probably ask them to do it on a volunteer basis, on the sense of you get all your accommodation and food and reasonable costs covered. However, I don't know the cost of mannequins, so I'm going to pass that one over.
Ian, great question. I think they, depending on how many actors you have, and as I was saying there, like who they are, because you can ask your local drama group to come in. The risk with standardized patients is getting them to play the role exactly as you need them to play it, and that becomes even more important if you're assessing people through simulation. So they can be very expensive. The Gucci mannequins, I mean, there is a huge range, maintenance cost for those, making sure that not only do they work, but that someone can operate them effectively, and you have to pay for that person. I would say what you need to do is weigh the cost on what you want to achieve from your simulation. So if your learning objective is to get people to interact appropriately and you want to test all those non-technical skills, then a standardized patient might be better, because your actor can give you feedback into how they felt within that simulation, and particularly if they're a well-trained standardized patient and they've done it a lot and they know the role they're playing, it can be really useful, whereas obviously a mannequin can give you nothing. In terms of the other part of your question, benefit of clinicians playing casualty, I've certainly done it. Having played a casualty, it gave me a whole new experience of how you feel, and the fact, that no one talks to you. I don't know if it's ever been measured as a learning experience. I feel like there should be some qualitative work on that out there, but I would certainly I might look it up actually after this, because that is very interesting. But no, I don't think it has, but I would definitely advise anyone to have a go, put yourself in the role of the patient. You'll learn a lot.
Yeah, and on that as well, just on another webinar that we actually broadcast quite recently, we had Tony Wallace in. I know it's not the same thing because it's not training, but it was about seeing it from both sides of the table, basically. So Tony is a clinician who got into a very, very bad accident, and she ended up being a rehabilitation patient. And she broadcast a webinar a couple of weeks ago called How I Survived Multiple Injuries. And she did speak for about 10 minutes in that of being both sides of it and sort of what it feels like to be a patient with the clinicians and that kind of thing as well. So that might be worth checking out as well, for that bit learning there. Evangelos has asked again, not asked the same question, that'd be silly, but has added on to their question. They would like to ask if you've taken into account the role of simple competence in a modern combat medical situation. How can we support them in learning how to put a tourniquet on themselves or others with zero medical experience and without ever having seen a hemorrhage?
Yeah, really, really good question. So the research that I've done, when I looked at my systematic review, I excluded non-medical personnel from my review. So I have to say I didn't look at the literature on that. However, it's become a really, really important aspect in Ukraine. And the Stop the Bleed course has been recently, I suppose, not redeveloped, but put out across Ukraine, because basically everyone in Ukraine now needs to know how to manage hemorrhage, which is a really, really sad situation that they're in. But in the recent conference, I was at a simulation conference where they presented what they've been doing. So there is work, and the Ukrainians are going to publish how they've managed to develop the Stop the Bleed course into a course for effectively civilians, teaching them how to manage major hemorrhage so that they can do it to save the lives of their family members, their friends with no medical experience. So I personally haven't taken that into account, but because of what is happening in the world at the moment, that is happening. And we will, if nothing else, if we can learn from what is happening in Ukraine, that is the only good thing that can come out of that war.
No, I completely agree. A simple and short question here from Mohammed, who has asked, is fidelity related directly to Dreyfus learner level?
Mohammed, great question. I'm going to be completely honest. I don't know what Dreyfus Learn level is. So I will have learnt something myself at the end of this webinar. So I'm going to write that down. I'm going to go read about it. I will tweet about it later. If you're available on Twitter, I will let you know.
Perfect. And finally, last but certainly not least, from Daniel, they have asked, my previous experience of cadaver training is in a controlled environment, labs for specific training. Do you know of / have you seen cadaver training used from point of wounding to the damage control surgery through the various teams, transport and facilities?
So yes, I have seen cadavers used from point of wounding to damage control surgery through teams, but not, we've always had to break the sim in terms of transport and facilities because of rules around what you can and can't do with cadavers in the UK. So quite often we've had to sort of say, we've had to use one cadaver in one location and then another cadaver in another location, or we've had to say we've had one tent that was our sort of point of wounding casualty clearing station, and then another area where we've said, and now you're in theatre, and we've just quickly moved them around and said, but there's been a 4-hour transport lag. It's the same problem you have with live animal models. There are so many restrictions with where you can and can't take them, what you can and can't do. The same as I was involved in a simulation where we wanted to fly our casualty. Well, the helicopter did take off, just the casualty wasn't in it because we couldn't move the casualty because nobody wanted their casualty in that particular modality in the back of their helicopter. So, these things happen. But it is, as soon as you start thinking about meso, macro, sim, cadavers, point of wounding all the way through, it's huge. And I guess that's why it happens less in the civilian setting, I would say, because it's just so difficult to organise, to get all of those people available at one time to run the simulation, to people to give up their time to run it, to design it. It's really, really difficult. We do it in the military probably because we have money and time and space, and we can order people to be there.
Yeah, fair enough. And as I said, there's lots of great courses out there that if you're not military based, that if you do want to do a simulated course, there are loads and loads of great courses out there that you can look up. So if you look up ATAC, World Extreme Medicine, they do they do sort of austere environment simulation courses. I think Medics Lodge do a couple of live courses as well as Icarus. They do obviously the VR simulated courses. There's absolutely loads out there if you take a look. And then back onto the Ukraine for that sort of stuff as well. If you look at UK Med, they do a lot of work out there as well, and they've got a lot of great resources for that. And they were part of the Stop the Bleed as well. So yeah, definitely have a look around. But yeah, it's such an interesting subject, and we were worried that it wasn't going to be anything that people wanted to engage with, but here we are. This is a nice segue into sort of a new look at trauma care, looking at the educational side of stuff as well as rather the clinical side of things. So thank you very much everyone for joining us tonight. All that's left to do is to thank our lovely and wonderful sponsors. First up, we have QualSafe. They are our first aid sponsors, and you can probably see that I'm wearing a t-shirt that the lovely Toby put together for me with QualSafe and trauma care together. If you scan the QR code that's on your screen now, you will go through to their website, which is qualsafeawards.org. They've got loads of qualifications on there. A lot of it is first aid focused. So if you're a CFR or a volunteer or a first aid trainer, loads of the courses on there will be applicable to you. And you get your certificates every time you do one of those as well. And take a look out for the teachings that are coming through soon as well. That's going to be really exciting. And next up, we have Galen, www.galen-pharma.com. If you scan the QR code that's on your screen there, it'll take you through to the website. You can find out all about the products that they have going, all about where they're from. They work all around the world, and have got lots of exciting things on the horizon, which is why I haven't got the usual screen up for them tonight, because they've got some great things coming out that I'm not allowed to reveal as of yet. And Icarus, we mentioned these guys before, and I think they've got mentioned in the chat as well. These guys work all over the world. They are a lovely sponsors. If you scan the QR code there, it's on your screen. It should take you through to the VR headset course, actually. But yeah, if you take a look at their website, they've got loads of training courses, but they also do lots of work around the world in extreme environments too. A lovely company, and we are so proud to have them on board. And World Extreme Medicine, it's so apt, isn't it? A lot of our sponsors are training people. So World Extreme Medicine, as I just mentioned as well, they scan the QR code that's on the screen there. It'll take you through to their conference page. They've got their Extreme Medicine conference coming up in November, and that is a 2-day course that's all about sort of trauma in sort of mountainous areas or in desert areas, those kind of situations, with lots of, and I think it's accredited by ATAC as well. So it's lots of live simulation, and that course is going to be absolutely incredible. And touch wood, we're not sure if it's happening yet, but we think Professor Sir Keith Porter, who is on annual leave this week, will be joining as a keynote lecturer at that conference as well. And I'm going to quickly fly through these. Our partners, Pro Trainings UK, and our academic partners, University of Gloucestershire, University of Sunderland, and the University of Wolverhampton. As I mentioned, the University of Sunderland does have the simulation room for their paramedic trainees, which is absolutely incredible. And the other two campuses, Gloucestershire and Wolverhampton, are absolutely beautiful places as well. Pro Trainings UK, as you know, do provide lots of first aid courses, including pet first aid, which is absolutely awesome. They've got over 400 courses available on their website. That's all there is to say from me tonight. I'm very glad to have joined you guys again. Thank you all for joining me. Cara, thank you so much for joining us from Krakow on your 6 weeks annual leave that you're in at the moment. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your holiday to join us and delivering such an interesting and thorough talk to everybody. So from wherever you are in the world, I've seen people from all over, including the Ukraine. Again, thank you very much again for joining us tonight. Wherever you are, take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones. Have a lovely evening. It's a goodbye from me. She didn't get the cue.
Didn't get it.
It's a goodbye from me. Never mind. Good night, all.